All right, Ian,
Pat,
we have a Patreon.
we do. Patreon.com/CU podcast. You go. You give us a little bit of money. You get the full video podcast in return. Hangouts once a month.
Bonus podcast almost every week now.
Almost every week. Go check that shit out.
You want to hear me talk about my Wegman cookies and the making of the NES Punk episode that just came out, Frankenstein? Ian can gloss. What is it? What's the term? I couldn't think of the word. But anyway, we have a Patreon poll topic. As you
wax about.
I say gloss. You can wax about Wegmans. We have a Patreon poll at second place as Ian de-dresses. What video game character do you look up to or admire? 24%. And in first place, with the bullet, the most important game consoles ever ranked. This comes from the Retro Substack from Seth Abramson. Nice enough to send me this, and we can go through this. So just like we went through with Seth, the worst NES games before, this was a simple sort of method he used. Well, not simple methodology, where he compiled via 55 media outlets and experts the definitive ranking of all 138 video game consoles ever released. This has stuff that to me doesn't even count as a video game system.
Lots of stuff in here that doesn't count, frankly.
But if it plays a video game in one form or another, it is ranked. So the methodology was only all-time rankings were considered, only best ever rankings with at least 10 consoles listed were considered, only lists that jointly judged handheld and full-size consoles were considered, and a bunch more. Sales data was not considered, nor lists predicated upon sales data, so it had nothing to do with the popularity.
This also includes things like the minis and stuff like that.
Sure. If a console appeared on a best ever list, but also appeared on a worst ever list, it received points, additions, and reductions, commensurate with the metrics used for both. So, he talks more about what he's talking about it. He talked about when he was a kid, there was a debate between Atari versus Intellivision, one of the first console wars right there, if not the first one. So, okay, you want to start with we'll start at 20 or just go right to the top 10 right here?
Let's go with the top 10.
Okay. Well, we'll just say what just missed it. What just missed it was Nintendo Wii and 3DS, just about 11, 12. Just missed the cut there.
Yep.
And I don't think they deserve to be in the top 10. If we're not doing it on popularity, just about more importance of the console, I guess, and what they brought to the table. Yeah, I guess game selections, things like that. I don't think, and importance to the industry. I don't think it
the Wii could have been for its importance, but I don't think for game playing, it really warrants being in the top 10.
But nothing didn't have a legacy, after
Wii?
that. In terms of they went to the Wii U, which failed.
Sure. I just feel like for its importance in the market, the amount of sales it did, for its motion controls.
Can't count the amount of sales.
Right.
You can't count that.
No, I know. I feel like it would have been more noted. But no, I get it.
Atari 2600, definitely at number 10. Yes. The Atari 2600 is what sort of blew up the console market.
And that was with 56 points.
Is that what the points in there?
Yeah. Gotcha.
Score in parentheses. Number of first place finishes on best ever worst in brackets. So it never got first place on any of these. But yeah, the 2600, really the first console to have the arcade ports on it. Obviously they tried and failed. It was a success with Space Invaders, which was a killer app, but failed at Pac-Man. So super important console for lots of reasons. It established, popularized the joystick and its form, everything else.
9, Nintendo Switch. And it's one of those things where I think about it and I try not to talk about anything when we try to look at something's place in a larger scope of things, like greatest video game consoles. I try to wait until after the generation to really think about it, reflect on it. Current. However, I will say that the Nintendo Switch is probably, and a lot of it's just timing, what's going on in my life, etc., but probably the system I've put the most hours into in any sort of recent memory.
Yeah.
Especially of modern systems. And a lot of it simply has to do with the portable and docking the way you can use it portably or you can dock it and use it at home. Something that I do think really did kind of shake up the industry, and I think you're going to see a lot more of going forward. I mean, the Steam Deck basically does it. I mean, the Steam Deck basically took that directly from the Switch. It docks or it goes portable.
That and being a success.
Yes.
Because if you try that and it failed, it'd be like, well, who cared? I know it's like, well, you can't do console sales, but we'll just say a massive success.
He didn't do console sales. We can bring them up.
Sure. So the fact that it was the first major hybrid console and was a massive success on top, this might be higher over time. This might shoot you the top 3 or 4 or 5, like potentially.
Yes.
I think. Especially if going forward, in my opinion, you'll never see a non-hybrid Nintendo console ever again after this. They don't have one ecosystem and that's it. There's no reason to go back and split it out for lots of different reasons.
They've proven they can do it, and I mean, it makes the most sense. They were always a portable centric. They were very successful with their portables. They wanted to still have a home console market. After the Wii U, there was no faith in that home console market.
Sure.
So what did they do? They made their portable their home console, and it worked.
Yeah, and they've never had a portable not be a success. You don't count the Virtual Boy; it's not really portable.
Wasn't portable.
Okay, number 8, Sega Genesis, absolutely. The Sega Genesis,
First real mainstream competition to Nintendo in the US. Absolutely important.
first direct arcade ports that like looked and plays at like
Very close.
Yeah.
I love the system.
First major mascot to take on Nintendo Mario with Sonic. Yeah,
Yeah.
like it's hugely important. It sold a good amount. It dominated the Super Nintendo for a bit before the Super Nintendo caught up later on. Number 7, Sony PlayStation 4. You can talk about more about that than me.
The PlayStation 4, I mean, was a good system with a better, I would say, online environment menu system UI than the Xbox One. I do think it's weird that these are on here. The PlayStation 4 is kind of like, I think it's really going to set the tone for how the next couple of generations, I think, of systems are looked at as more like computers that can be, upgraded with pro models in between.
Because the 3 you couldn't. Right?
And I think also the big thing that I think the PlayStation 4 and to a lesser extent the Xbox One foretold last generation is we're just going to see a lot less games on these systems because the marketing the budgets, the production budgets for these games have gotten so high.
Less AAA exclusives.
Yeah, less AAA exclusives, more stuff that's timed exclusive if exclusive at all. Less overall titles, and I think. These companies are really going to have to start focusing more on their online stores and making those more enjoyable to browse through, because I think a lot of sales are going to start coming from smaller indie type games in the interim in between the big AAA titles.
So you're saying that PS4 is like almost like it's the modern console, like
I would call it,
designation.
yeah. I mean, I don't have that whole lot to say about it.
Number 6 is Nintendo 64.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know.
It's interesting because
it's one with a lot of fans, a lot of fanboys, but I feel like it's more of a vocal minority than it is a true representation of. I think it's the people who had one, they loved it, they found stuff to love on it, and that's great.
I think that the issue with putting this in the top 10, I'm not saying it deserve a place in the top 20, top 25, because obviously there's
top 20 for sure, and I can make the argument for the top 10 because the Nintendo stuff that came out on that system, I mean that the first party output on there, the Zelda, the 3D Marios, games like Mario Party, stuff like Mario, Pokemon Snap, it really kind of showed what Nintendo's game design was going to be like going forward. And the first party stuff was good.
And Super Mario 64 is one of the most important games ever.
Sure.
So like that alone could get you there.
And I get that. But it's like really, I know it's the cliche, but it's true. Once you get outside the first party stuff in maybe 10 to 15 other really good third party titles, you're left with racing games and sports games, and there's just not a whole lot.
I think the hit against Nintendo 64 is this. It's almost like the same thing with the Wii. It was like, yeah, we sold some, but then we stopped. Like the 64
We sold some, but we stopped.
The Nintendo 64, I wouldn't put this in my top 10 because if it was in my top 10, what's in 4th place would never bother to flourish. The holding on to the cartridge was so out of date by 96.
Right.
It was years past its expiration date to use the cartridge. If they had gone with the CD format, the 64 might be the number 1 or 2 or 3 console ever. I could have made that. Like to me, the 64 for that alone shouldn't be in the top. It was outdated. The 64 was outdated in terms of its software tech. To me, Not talking about like, oh, like obviously the architecture, we can do all those amazing things. I'm just talking about like they should not have used the cartridge. At all. Because of that, there was almost no RPGs on the system. You had companies like Square say, fuck you. Fuck you. We're not doing Final Fantasy on your system. We just can't do it. It's ridiculous. So that's why, to me, it does not make the top 10.
Xbox 360 at number 5. We got to move through them. So Xbox 360 at number 5. Much like I think the PS4 was like the defining console of last generation, I feel like the 360 was more defining than the PlayStation 3 or the Wii when it comes to AAA Gen 7 games. Everyone had one. It was kind of the system that got me back into modern gaming. I think what's very important for the Xbox 360 is it was the first system to really get that online game, really figured out the online gameplay and the online environment. With the lists and the Xbox Live Arcade store. It is, love it or hate it or love how they set it up, it is the blueprint that Sony and Nintendo followed.
I was going to say also the one that really got the online multiplayer to
that's my whole point. Yeah, the 360 is important in and of itself just for the also, online multiplayer.
Digital game storefront, all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there was so much things that they did right. Controller was ass with a D-pad, but that aside,
So yeah, number 4, Sony PlayStation. There's actually a lot I want to say about it, but not really. It's in conjunction with the PlayStation 2, so we're gonna wait. I'm not gonna give away what spot that is, but it's coming. But yes, the switch from cartridge to CD got a lot of people, I think, to grab it based on the flash, the graphics, but also you could do a whole lot more with that space. CDs were cheaper to manufacture, and the CD reading system that was running off of more, I don't want to say off the shelf, but less complicated tech was cheaper to sell, and the prices came down very quickly on PlayStations, and the rest is history.
And they were radically different. A lot of those games were radically different than the N64.
Yes.
So it was like a true competitor, like more so than Genesis was to the Super. PlayStation to the N64 was a radical departure.
Comparing PlayStation games to N64 games was almost never something that went well in the 64's favor.
Yes. So and obviously now Sony's a huge powerhouse, so you have to put them in the top.
Yeah. If
not the top 5, top 10 for Sony PlayStation. Number 3, the NES. Of course, it's going to make the top 5 for lots of reasons. It brought back the home console market to most of the world, especially North America.
It was, for a whole generation of millennials, it was probably the first thing you actually played video games on, unless you're playing a hand-me-down 2600, because there were a couple of years there where it wasn't a viable thing.
It broke through into the mass more so than Atari did, way more so. Nintendo broke through into the popular culture in a huge way, with multiple mascots and franchises that Atari could only. When the Atari era was only Pac-Man. That's what broke through. Huge, but that was it. For Nintendo, you had everything.
You had Mario, you had Zelda, you had everything. And
Metroid.
I can't remember where I talked about this, but something that is
you had a movie,
worth noting.
Wizard.
Nintendo was the first company, I think, to really
figure out the formula.
Yeah, to really use video games as video games. They embraced it. They embraced video games for what they were. Yeah. When you were on the Atari, you did get some single player stuff. You got your adventure and your Indiana Jones, but most of it was very simple arcade type stuff, and a lot of it was like, if you weren't playing with 2 players, what the hell was the point? Anyways, it was treated as a lot of them were looked at as like board games, but on your computer. Yes. It was neat in that sort of way.
The NES, in interviews, have always said it was just evolved enough to break through.
Right. They embraced what they could do, and they created, long, but in some instances like Zelda, sure, but they created longer, more enriching experiences.
The graphics looked like cartoons. That was a huge thing. You couldn't do that on Atari or even on ColecoVision a little bit, but not like you could do. There's a big difference between Smurf on ColecoVision and Legend of Zelda and Metroid. It's a step up, and that's why I think they broke through as well with kids. Super Nintendo number 2. That to me is too high. But I see why they're basing that solely on basically the Super Nintendo is the natural progression. It's the Super Nintendo. It's a Super NES. It is. It's the natural progression in the hardware and in the controller, obviously, which is one of the best controllers ever still. That's why I put it that high, but maybe not number 2. And you go from Metroid to Super Metroid. You go from Legend of Zelda to Link to the Past. So it's the natural upgrade. Super Mario World. So like, that makes sense. I'm not sure I would have put it 2, but I can top 5. I think maybe top 6. I would put it in my list.
Which takes us to number 1, the Sony PlayStation 2, and I agree. Much like the Super Nintendo, and we don't see this a lot, I don't think, in video games. Much like the Super Nintendo seemed like the perfect evolution of the Nintendo, the PlayStation 2 seemed like the perfect evolution of the PlayStation. They didn't change anything up too drastically.
Same controller, just about.
They looked at what worked and they kept running with it. The main thing that I think puts that to me solidly cements the PlayStation 2 at number 1. And you don't have to worry about what people think about your hobby. I don't. But the PlayStation 2, I think, is kind of the defining video games are in the mainstream and are now mostly acceptable
to adults, everyone.
Yes.
You think the DVD player has something to do with that to some extent?
I don't think it does in the long run. I mean,
but it helped.
It certainly helped. But I think it really was just PlayStation caught fire. And by the time the PlayStation 1 was fizzling out at the end of my time in high school, it had already started. This is why I was talking about when we brought it up at number 4. It had already started to kind of break those boundaries. People were buying the Madden games. The jocks were buying Madden.
And they were teens then.
Yeah. The stoners were playing Final Fantasy VII because they saw a cool TV commercial and they found out I'm playing it and they're like, oh, this story is great. You had all sorts of people like really kind of dipping into these games as PlayStation came down in price from $200 to $150 to $100 or whatever it was. And people started snapping them up. And then I think by the end of that, people were just getting so excited. There was no way the PlayStation 2 could fail. And
they were young adults by then. And they kept with it. They didn't give it up.
Right. Exactly.
So it's our generation that went from NES to like Genesis, we'll just say, or Super, and then PlayStation, and then.
But people of our age, I think I would be interested in finding out. I think there's probably a good amount of people our age who maybe never did Nintendo and Super Nintendo.
They skipped that?
And Genesis. But I feel like PlayStation 2 really was the system that kind of brought everyone into video games.
So that was like the first one that was kids, adults, everyone, and now more so than the PlayStation.
Yeah.
PlayStation was more marketed towards teens, I would probably think.
Sure. And like I said, I think Sony realized that they had a way to keep this momentum going, and that was basically don't change much of anything, just make the graphics better. And that's what they did.
So the PlayStation 2, more than any other console, that was like the wide accepted console, almost harkening back to the Atari when they marketed to adults and kids.
Yeah.
And then that was abandoned for 20 plus years, almost over 20 years. And then we're back to.
And I feel like it's probably the smoothest, savviest follow-up to a console we've seen. I love the Switch, but I mean, you need 2 parts to. The Wii U is a disaster. The PlayStation to the PlayStation 2, I think, is maybe the most dominant any one company has been.
It was natural because like the Super Nintendo did not do as well as the NES.
I was going to say you can't even necessarily say the NES and Super Nintendo because Sega came in, there was competition, etc. I don't think Microsoft did well enough with the Xbox to stay around, but it didn't really
hurt.
Yeah,
Sony
it didn't hurt Sony.
Yeah, no,
it's probably the most, like I said, the most dominant 10-year run of a company.
I'm talking about the games that much, but obviously there was thousands of games, 2,000 plus games on the PlayStation 2. I mean, they produced games on it for like 12, 13 years.
Yeah.
On the PS2. I mean, that's insane to do that. All right, well, that's thanks, Seth, for helping with that list. That was a good one.